My dad was a hero." The words split the silence like thunder cracking across the stone walls of the military courtroom. 11-year-old Nora Callahan's voice, usually no louder than a whisper, rang through the chamber with such fierce clarity that even the presiding judge paused mid-sentence. Dozens of officers, advisors, and civilians turned to look at her, their faces a blend of pity, discomfort, and unease. But Nora didn't flinch. Her small fists were balled tight at her sides, her chin high, and her chest heaving with defiance. In front of her, the verdict had just been announced. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Callahan, posthumously convicted of treason against the United States. If he had survived the operation in the Middle East 6 months earlier, he would have been sentenced to death. To Nora, that courtroom wasn't about justice. It was a stage for betrayal, silent men in uniforms hiding behind rules, afraid to admit a mistake. Her father hadn't just been a soldier. He had been the rock of her world, the protector who never let her fall. And now, they branded him a traitor without letting her speak a single word in his defense. She felt a firm hand on her shoulder, but she jerked away. Colonel Robert Maddox, her father's commanding officer and longtime family friend, her godfather, knelt beside her, his face a mask of sorrow. "Nora, please, this isn't the place." But she didn't trust that voice anymore. Neither did Max. From the back of the courtroom, a low, guttural growl rumbled. Max, the aging German shepherd who had served in Nathan's elite counterterrorism unit, stood tense at the edge of the benches. His dark eyes were locked on Maddox, body rigid, ears back. The dog's posture made several guards instinctively reach for their belts, but Max didn't lunge. He simply watched, every muscle saying, "Not him, not now, not near her." Max had changed since the funeral. No longer a dog seeking commands, he had become Nora's shadow, her guardian, as if something deep within him had broken too. They'd been inseparable ever since the military handed Max over to Ruth Callahan, Nora's grandmother and sole guardian. Ruth was a retired schoolteacher who had once taught hundreds of children how to read, how to ask questions, but nothing could prepare her for raising a granddaughter who no longer spoke in full sentences. Ruth led Nora out of the courtroom, her hand hovering protectively near the girl's back. Reporters waited on the courthouse steps like wolves. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. None of them meant for answers, only sound bites. Inside the car, Nora sat stone-faced while Max rested his head on her knee, sensing her grief. Ruth's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, but she said nothing. There were no words left after what the government had done. When they pulled into Heritage Lane, everything looked smaller. The home Nathan had bought after returning from overseas, the same porch he used to sit on polishing Max's harness while Nora painted on the sidewalk, was covered in crude spray-painted words. Traitor. Liar. Shame. The American flag they had flown since Nora's birth had been torn, its shreds tangled in the hedges. The mailbox hung crooked, and someone had smashed the front window with a brick. Max growled low again, but didn't bark. Nora stepped out, barely registering Ruth's gasp, and approached the porch as if in a trance. She knelt beside the ruined flag, hands trembling as she gathered its fragments. That night, while Ruth cleaned glass and boarded the window, Nora sat on her bed with Max at her feet. The moonlight spilled across her father's old books stacked in the corner. The air in the room still held the faintest trace of his aftershave. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a chasm. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a photo. It showed Nathan in uniform, kneeling between a younger Nora and Max. All three were smiling. Behind them, the flag flew, proud and whole. Tears finally came, not in gasps or sobs, but in quiet, steady rivulets, that made no sound as they fell onto Max's fur. The dog stirred slightly, then pressed his nose to her hand. And that was when she knew. Whatever had been taken from her, her voice, her father's honor, her home, it wasn't gone. It had been buried. And Max remembered. In the weeks that followed, Pinebridge turned colder. Not just in temperature, but in how people crossed the street to avoid Ruth and Nora. The teachers at school gave polite smiles, but no warmth. Nora stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria. She stopped answering questions in class. The only place she seemed alive was in the woods behind the house, where she walked with Max beneath the brittle branches, retracing the paths her father had once used for training. Max responded to odd spots in the forest, stopping, sniffing, then staring back at her, as if waiting for her to see something invisible. At first, she thought he was just confused, but after the third time, she began to wonder. The night it rained, she awoke to Max pawing at the back door. Ruth had long since gone to bed. Nora pulled on her coat and followed the dog into the storm. They ran through the yard, through the field, into the forest, until Max stopped suddenly at a patch of uneven earth near a moss-covered rock. He sniffed, then began to dig. Nora dropped to her knees beside him, hands sinking into wet soil. Minutes passed. Her heart pounded. Then she felt it. Metal. A box. She pried it loose. Inside was a flash drive and a folded slip of paper. Her father's handwriting stared up at her in sharp, hurried strokes. Max knows the way. Lightning cracked above the trees. In that moment, Nora Callahan no longer felt small. She felt chosen. The silence that followed the court-martial verdict seemed to press against the very air of Pinebridge, thick and suffocating, as if the town itself were complicit in what had happened. Nathan Callahan, once revered, now remembered in whispers, had not just been condemned by a military court, he had been erased from history, scrubbed clean from the walls of honor in the town square. His name, once etched into brass under the words, "For service and valor," had been quietly unscrewed by city workers before dawn. No ceremony, no flags, no mourning. But for Nora Callahan, the pain wasn't historical. It was immediate. It was the empty seat at the kitchen table, the echoing sound of her father's boots that would never return, and the way the world looked at her as if she was a shadow, too. Ruth tried to carry on like the schoolteacher she once was, raising early to prepare oatmeal, marking the calendar with routines as though they could anchor a granddaughter in a world that had come undone. But Nora rarely spoke now, and when she did, it was only to Max, the stoic German shepherd who rarely left her side. Max had served alongside Nathan in Task Force Orion, their bond forged in desert silence and firelight patrols. Now, he was just a dog in a quiet house, guarding the only truth he seemed to understand. Nora needed him, and he would not let her down. The house on Heritage Lane had once been the warmest on the block, with yellow shutters and wind chimes on the porch that sang even on windless days. But since the verdict, the shutters had been spray-painted with red slashes, and the chimes had been torn down. The townsfolk who once brought pies and flags on Veterans Day now crossed the street when they saw Ruth walking Max. Inside the house, entire rooms had been sealed by the government, covered in plastic sheeting stamped with red-lettered warnings about classified materials. Nathan's study had been the first to go. They came with boxes and clipboards, removed everything. Computers, files, even the framed commendations on the walls. To the authorities, it was just a sweep. To Nora, it felt like a robbery. But some things, some truths, hide in plain sight. One night, when the storm outside rattled the windows and Ruth had gone to bed early with a migraine, Max became restless. He paced the hallway, ears alert, tail stiff. Then he nudged Nora's hand and walked to the closed door of her father's old study. The plastic seal had loosened slightly near the baseboard. Max began to scratch gently at a floorboard under the desk, pause precise, movement purposeful. Nora, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in weeks, hope, knelt beside him. She pulled at the edge of the floorboard until it creaked and gave way. Beneath the wood lay a small tin lockbox, worn by time, edges rusted. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside, there was a USB drive wrapped in cloth and a single sheet of lined paper. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, efficient, but this time uneven, almost rushed. Max knows the way. She stared at the note. Her breath held so long it made her dizzy. What did it mean? Where was it supposed to lead? Ruth found her sitting there the next morning, the box open on her lap. Max curled protectively at her feet. "Where did you get that?" Ruth's voice was hushed, not angry, worried. Nora held out the note, wordless, but her eyes burned with purpose. That day, they took the USB to Charlotte Vega, an old friend of Nathan's who had been a JAG officer before retiring. Charlotte now worked part-time at the Pine Bridge Legal Aid Center, a woman with silver-threaded hair and eyes too sharp to have ever gone soft. She read the note, turned the drive over in her fingers, and said, "If your father left this, it's because he knew someone would try to erase everything he died protecting." They didn't plug in the USB at Charlotte's desk. Instead, she ushered them into the back room, shut the blinds, and inserted the drive into her personal laptop, which hadn't seen an internet connection in years. Encrypted files, video logs, names, coordinates. At first glance, it was fragmented, like someone had taken a story and scattered the pages into the wind. But Charlotte recognized pieces. She saw procurement trails, unusually large orders of untraceable weapons, dates that aligned with classified missions Nathan had once briefed. And she saw one name over and over again, Maddox. "He's not just a name in these files," Charlotte murmured. "He's the architect of something bigger." That night, as Ruth made soup and tried to pretend life was normal, Nora sat in the hallway with Max, whispering to him as if he might reply. "You knew this, didn't you?" she said. "You were trying to tell me." Max rested his head on her lap, eyes open, alert. He didn't blink. There was no turning back now. The past wasn't done. And with Max beside her, Nora understood what the message meant. A dog trained for war. A daughter haunted by silence. And a trail waiting to be followed. Together, they would find the truth buried behind the flag, no matter how deep they had to dig. By the time the sky dimmed over Pine Bridge and the street lamps buzzed to life along the cracked sidewalks, Nora Callahan was already halfway across town. She had memorized the route, the back alleys behind the laundromat, the overgrown trail behind the high school gym, the forgotten path that led to the corner where the old library stood like a tired sentinel. Max padded silently behind her, his footfalls no louder than the whisper of leaves in wind. The USB drive nestled deep in her coat pocket felt like a key to something older than truth and more dangerous than lies. Earlier that afternoon, she had skipped school, again. Her grandmother hadn't tried to stop her. Ruth had taken one look at the shadows under Nora's eyes, the way she stared out the kitchen window with the same frozen silence that used to fill Nathan's face before deployment, and simply handed her a paper bag with a peanut butter sandwich and a thermos of hot tea. No questions, just faith. The library's rear door creaked with disuse, its hinges stiff with rust and rain. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ghosts. Charlotte Vega was waiting in the study room at the back, surrounded by stacks of faded legal volumes, her silver-gray hair pulled tight beneath a wool beret. The former JAG officer had lived through 3 wars, 2 divorces, and one assassination attempt. She didn't scare easy. Nora placed the USB on the table between them like it was a detonator. "It was my dad's," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "I think someone killed him for what's on this." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. She slid the drive into her secure laptop, fingers moving like clockwork. The loading bar crawled forward. Then the screen went black. For a long second, neither of them breathed. Then a flicker of green text scrolled across the screen. "Enter phrase to unlock." "It's encrypted," Charlotte muttered. "Military grade, definitely black ops. He knew they'd come for him." Nora frowned. "He used to say something before leaving for missions. He'd kiss my forehead and say, 'Keep an eye on the penguin.'" Charlotte glanced sideways. "Penguin?" Nora pulled out the keychain from her backpack, a worn plush penguin with one eye missing. "He gave it to me when I was 5. Charlotte typed, "Penguin." The screen flickered. Then it opened. Lines of files, audio clips, and video logs unfurled like a classified confession. Reports tied Colonel Maddox to illegal arms trades in East Africa. There were records of offshore bank transfers, emails to front companies, and most damning, a clipped video of Maddox speaking in a low voice to a man with a blurred-out face. "We send Callahan in. He's clean, too clean. Won't return." Charlotte leaned back, color drained from her cheeks. "Your father wasn't the traitor. He was the liability." The library lights flickered, then dimmed. Outside, Max growled low in his throat. A shadow passed the frosted window. "We need to move," Charlotte said, snapping the laptop shut and placing it in a lead-lined briefcase. "Now!" They slipped out through the archive basement. Max took point, his ears pinned and body tense. They exited into the cold night air, then doubled back through a maze of alleys until they reached Charlotte's old Jeep Cherokee. Instead of heading home, they turned north. Hours later, they pulled into a clearing beneath Mount Elora, where the wind howled like something ancient and restless. The hunting cabin belonged to Lucas Hart, Nathan's closest friend from their academy days, a man who had disappeared from the public eye after a failed mission that left 3 soldiers dead and his name redacted from the Army's official history. Lucas stood on the porch, one arm in a sling, a rifle in the other. He looked at Nora, then at Max. "I figured you'd come," he said, stepping aside. "Nathan said if anything ever happened, the girl and the dog would find me." The cabin smelled of cedar and old regrets. Inside, Charlotte began transferring files to encrypted hard drives, while Lucas showed Nora a dusty map Nathan had once sent him, marked with odd symbols and coordinates. Max paced restlessly, occasionally stopping to sniff corners where dust hadn't been disturbed in years. Then he stopped, his nose pressed against a faded trunk in the corner. Inside were training manuals, photographs, and a journal filled with Nathan's writing. At the bottom, a laminated card with a series of numbers. 46.2789 degrees north, 82.1278 degrees west. Charlotte cross-referenced the coordinates. "It's a remote safe house in Northern Virginia. If he hid something, it's there." Outside, snow began to fall. Max curled beside the fireplace, eyes half-lidded but ears still sharp. Nora sat beside him, her fingers resting against his collar. She knew this dog wasn't just her protector. He was the last living piece of her father's world. A world of codes, shadows, and promises kept in silence. Tomorrow they would head east. But tonight, beneath the wind-streaked roof of an exile, Nora felt something unfamiliar settle in her bones. Not hope, not yet, but something close. To be continued. The cabin, nestled in the crook of Mount Elora's eastern ridge, had always been more of a memory than a shelter, its weathered logs and moss-darkened shingles echoing the past in a way that made the air itself feel heavy. It had once belonged to Nathan's closest friend and former field medic, Lucas Hart, a man now living like a ghost in the pines, the war never truly behind him. The fire in the stone hearth burned low when Charlotte, Nora, and Max arrived, their breath fogging in the cold air, eyes darting like prey, sensing the hunt was not far behind. Lucas welcomed them with a grim nod and only the necessary words. There wasn't time for reunions. Charlotte laid out the encrypted hard drive. Nora unpacked the contents of the metal box, maps, photos, and one final flash drive still wrapped in the corner of an old Marine-issued undershirt. As they reviewed the files, Lucas confirmed what Nathan had only hinted at before his death. Maddox had been meeting under false identities with operatives linked to international weapons networks, leveraging his position to move arms through defense aid routes masked as humanitarian logistics. The documents were damning, including timestamps, bank ledgers, and photographs Maddox never thought would surface. Then came the audio file, rough with static but clear enough to freeze the room. It was a meeting, Maddox's voice unmistakable, discussing how to reassign Callahan to an extraction op with no return. Charlotte's hand went cold on the mouse. Nathan hadn't just been sent to die, he'd been silenced. Max growled low near the front door just seconds before the back window shattered. Shouts cracked the silence like thunder. They were compromised. Charlotte shoved the laptop into her bag, Nora grabbed the box, and Lucas pulled the old hunting rifle from under the couch. "Get her out," he told Charlotte, his voice steady in the storm. Max was already moving, body low, ears flat, guiding them through the back exit into the trees, as Lucas covered their retreat with 2 warning shots that echoed like cannon fire through the canyon. They didn't look back. The forest was alive with chaos. Dogs barking in the distance, drone rotors buzzing overhead. But Max ran with purpose, weaving them through brush and over rocks, across streams and under low pine canopies, each move precise, as if he had memorized every escape Nathan had ever taught him. Nora stumbled, her knees scraped and bleeding, but she never let go of the box. Charlotte breathed like a woman pulling air through smoke, her instincts the only compass in the dark. They crossed a ridge and followed an old fire trail that Lucas had once mapped years ago, a forgotten artery through the wilderness that now offered their only hope of escape. The rain began to fall in fine, needling sheets, chilling them to the bone, but Max never faltered. He would pause at junctions, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling, before choosing the right path as though retracing memories burned into muscle and bone. After what felt like hours, they reached the outskirts of Charleston. Charlotte made a call from a burner phone, and within 30 minutes, a battered green pickup pulled into the clearing outside the woods. Behind the wheel was Walter Merrick, his face aged but sharp, eyes carrying the same steel Nora remembered from faded photographs of her father's training at West Point. Merrick said nothing as they climbed in. He just looked at Nora, then at Max, and nodded once. The ride was silent, the rhythm of the tires over gravel the only sound, until they reached his ranch, a place that hadn't changed since the last photo Nora had seen in her father's footlocker. The house stood firm against time, windows aglow, a quiet fortress steeped in memory. Inside, under dim lamplight and the scent of cedar and oil, they spread the evidence out again on a wide oak table scarred by decades of use. Merrick moved slowly but with authority, connecting files, recognizing names, whispering curses under his breath. He pointed to one file folder with a long-forgotten insignia. It matched a seal Nathan had etched onto the base of his old desk back home, under the painting of the Appalachian Range that hung crooked since the day Nora was born. "There's more," Merrick murmured. His finger tapped the insignia twice. He hid the final cache back in Pinebridge, inside the house. "The last piece of this puzzle, if we find it, could take Maddox down for good." Charlotte's shoulders stiffened. Returning meant danger, meant exposure, meant risking everything they had already managed to keep hidden. But it was Nora who broke the silence. Her voice soft but firm, shaped by grief and the weight of a truth too long buried. "We have to go back," she said, eyes locked on the files, then to the firelight that danced across Max's fur. "We owe him that." Outside, the wind clawed at the walls, rustling the trees like whispers of those who had never come home. But inside, the three of them sat wrapped in a silence born not of fear, but of quiet conviction. Max lay at Nora's feet, head resting on his paws, amber eyes watching her, not with the gaze of an animal, but with something deeper. An understanding, a memory, a promise. He didn't need words to speak his resolve. He had followed Nathan into hell once before, and now, with Nora, he would do it again. They would go back, through the storm, through the shadows, through the lies, and they would not return empty-handed, because some truths, no matter how deeply buried, will always claw their way back into the light. They came back under the cover of darkness, riding the edge of risk like soldiers retracing a ghost's final steps. Heritage Lane was quiet, too quiet. The porch light on the Callahan house flickered, either from faulty wiring or from the weight of the years since Nathan had last walked beneath it. Nora sat between Merrick and Charlotte in the back seat of the truck, Max pressed to her side. His ears twitched at every sound, his muscles taut like coiled wire, as though he sensed what none of them could yet see. They parked 3 blocks away and cut through yards thick with fallen leaves. Every step was muffled by memory. Nora had walked this same sidewalk thousands of times, but tonight it felt like crossing a minefield. The neighborhood that had once left casseroles on their porch now left nothing but silence. Max led the way, his gait slow, deliberate. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just moved with purpose, head low, until they reached the back fence. Merrick gave her a leg up. The house was dark. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of her father's aftershave and old paper. It was as though the house had exhaled the moment she stepped in. Charlotte stayed downstairs to keep watch. Nora and Max slipped into the study, the room that had once held bedtime stories, topographical maps, and the scent of mission reports still warm from the printer. She stared at the painting of the Appalachian Range, crooked as always. Max sat beside it. Her hand reached for the frame, trembling. She tilted it off the wall. Behind it, etched into the drywall, was the faint outline of a square. The numbers 729, her birthday, scratched below in faded graphite. She pressed them like buttons. A pop. The panel slid open to reveal a fireproof case wedged into the wall cavity. She pulled it free and opened it with the key her father had once kept on a chain she now wore around her neck. Inside was a solid-state drive, a set of sealed documents marked classified, and a handwritten letter on old Army-issue notepaper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was clean, deliberate, unmistakably his. "Doing right will never be easy, Nora, but it's always worth it. The truth is what keeps us from becoming what we fight against. If you're reading this, I didn't make it, but Max did. Trust him. He knows the way. And trust yourself. You're stronger than you know." Tears didn't come right away. Instead, there was a numbness, a silence so deep it pressed against her bones. Max nudged her hand gently. She nodded. Suddenly, headlights flashed across the wall. Voices outside. The front door crashed inward. Charlotte's voice, sharp and defiant, rang out in protest. Maddox had come and he wasn't alone. He had men, weapons, orders. Merrick, waiting across the alley, saw them move in. He whispered into the radio, giving Nora the signal. Max moved without command, pressing his weight against the hallway door, guiding her upward to the attic crawlspace Nathan had reinforced years ago. They hid as Charlotte bought them time, her voice rising in distraction, demanding a warrant. In the dark, Nora could hear Max's breath steady beside her. She clutched the drive against her chest. Merrick, moving with the same training he'd once given to Nathan, flanked the house through the kitchen door. 2 stun grenades, non-lethal, bought him the few seconds he needed. In the chaos, he grabbed Charlotte, Nora, and Max. They fled through the side alley and into the waiting SUV. They didn't stop until they reached the regional command office. Merrick didn't waste time. He stormed into the room where senior military officials were finishing a briefing. At first, no one listened, but when he laid out the contents of the hard drive, maps, weapons logs, private emails, covert transfer records, all connected to Maddox's signature and authorization codes, the room changed. Charlotte submitted the audio file. Maddox's voice ordering a mission for Nathan, knowing it was a setup. Photos of meetings with known arms dealers were displayed. Bank transfers routed through shell charities. One by one, the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Maddox was summoned. He arrived in full uniform, unaware of the trap he was walking into. He didn't leave in uniform. That evening, Charlotte was released without charges. Merrick was offered reinstatement, which he declined. He had seen enough. But the spotlight turned to Nora, not as a victim, but as the girl who exposed a truth that grown men had tried to bury. At her father's memorial, held a month later at the base chapel overlooking the foothills, Nora stood behind the podium, a black ribbon on her wrist, her voice steady before a sea of uniforms. Max sat beside her, upright and solemn. "I used to think heroes never fell," she began. "But now I know, it's not whether they fall. It's what they stand for when they do." She paused, her hand resting on Max's back. "My dad believed in truth, even when it cost everything. And thanks to him and to Max, we all know it now." The crowd rose in silence. Salutes were held a little longer. Eyes stayed damp a little longer. And as the sun sank behind the range, casting long gold shadows across the flag-draped stone, Nora looked to the sky and whispered a single promise. "We will never forget the truth you stood for, Dad." And Max, ever faithful, rested his head on her foot, not because the speech was done, but because his duty too had finally come full circle.